Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Debating the Declaration of Independence, a professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. My name is Richard Schramm. I'm the Vice President for Education Programs at the Center, and I'll be moderating this evening's session. Before we get into the heart of the matter this evening, let me just briefly introduce you to America in Class and the National Humanities Center. America in Class is sponsored by the Humanities Center, and we're an institute for advanced study located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. Our main mission is to provide fellowships to scholars from abroad so that they can come to the center and research and write on topics in literature, history, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. But we also offer a wide array of programs and resources for American history and literature teachers. You already discovered our webinars, and if you'll go to americainclass.org, you will discover all the resources that we provide for teaching American history and literature. One of the things we provide is a series of lessons, and I want to point out to you a related lesson, a lesson that relates to our subject tonight. During our discussion, we are going to mention Thomas Paine's Common Sense, and we have a really good lesson on that. We look at excerpts from Common Sense to answer that question you see there on the lesson. How did Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense convince reluctant Americans to abandon the goal of reconciliation with Britain and accept that separation from Britain, independence, was the only option for preserving their liberty? We take excerpts from the document and we set them up for close reading. Please take a look at that. I think it would make a very valuable addition to your toolbox of teaching resources. I also want to point out another resource that we provide for you. In Making the Revolution, one of our teaching anthologies, we have a well-annotated version of the Declaration of Independence. This version annotates all of the charges that the colonists lodged against the crown. We explain what those charges are, what their origins were. An excellent teaching tool. I recommend that to you. We also have a Pinterest site, and there we post a wide array of our resources, from not just from our lessons and our teaching anthologies, but from our secondary material as well. And we also post useful material from other sources online as well. So please check that out. I think you'll find a lot of really useful material on our Pinterest site. Now, when the seminar is over this evening, please go to the Debating the Declaration homepage. There you will find a recording of the program as long with a PowerPoint. Please feel free to plunder that PowerPoint and use it in your classes. That's what it's there for. You will also find an evaluation form. Please fill that out for us, flash it back to us, and once we get that, we will send you documentation of participation so that you'll be able to present that to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation in this webinar warrants. How do you participate? I'm sure you know we're going to be talking, our scholar tonight, Holly Brewer, is going to be making presentations. We're going to be looking at some text. From time to time, we'll be asking discussion questions. To respond, put your cursor in the lower right-hand corner in that long, narrow rectangular box that I've outlined there in green on the screen. Type your response, hit that send button, and your message will appear in the large chat box above. I'll be watching the chat all night, and I'll be bringing it into the conversation at appropriate moments. But don't wait for us to ask a question. If you have a question or a comment you'd like to make, please do. Please put that in, and I will bring it into the conversation when I can. I can't promise that I'll get to everybody's comments tonight, but I will do my best. So don't hesitate. If you have a question or a comment, let us know. And remember, the first law of successful webinars, the more you participate, the better the webinar. So let's get underway. Our webinar tonight is going to address 5 large framing questions. And let me put those on the table right now. Did all men are created equal mean to include the enslaved initially? And if so, did it retain its meaning after the deleted clauses were removed, clauses that clarified that meaning? How did British support of slavery and the slave trade, and particularly that of their kings, shape the development of slavery in America? How did the final deliberations over independence shape the meaning of the final document? How can the debate over the Declaration help us understand the divergence between the North and the South on questions of slavery by the 1790s? And finally, how does this debate help us understand the long-term legacy of this crucial founding text? To lead us through those questions tonight, we're very pleased to have with us Holly Brewer, the Burke Chair of American History and Associate Professor at the University of Maryland. Holly was a fellow at the National Humanities Center in 2009-10. She has written widely on American colonial history. In 2005, she published By Birth or Consent, Children, Law, and the Anglo-American Revolution in Authority. Now let me turn her microphone on and turn the program over to her. Holly, how did they debate the Declaration back in 1776?
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. And thank you to the National Humanities Center, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Can everyone hear me okay? I guess they can't answer, right? Of course. But I guess. Yes, I hear lots of yeses. Okay, I see lots of yeses, so that's good.
If they didn't hear us,
I'm going to begin with some modern references. Barack Obama's controversial pastor, Jeremiah Wright, preached in January 2008 as Obama was running for president that from the beginning the U.S. government had lied about their belief that all men were created equal. He argued that in truth, they only thought that all white men were created equal, the founders did. Obama responded by distancing himself from Wright not only in practice but in principle, and not only during the campaign, but in his inauguration speech. America's revolution was about a promise that has only been fulfilled over time and with conscious effort. Quote, "The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble ideal passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all men are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness." So did that powerful phrase from the Declaration of Independence mean only whites? The Ku Klux Klan argued that it did in the 1960s. So too do many historians, sociologists, and political scientists who search through the writings of Jefferson and others to argue that on some level the most basic American promise was marred by embedded racism. American historians, certainly from the time of Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom in 1975, point likewise to America's paradox, theorizing that in some strange way America's freedoms come only at the cost of slavery, of the enslavement of others. The answer to this question is of fundamental importance to Americans even today. But if freedom depended necessarily upon slavery, why did northern states take steps immediately in the wake of 1776 to make plans to abolish slavery, albeit gradually? Why was slavery controversial in the 19th century? Why were slaves emancipated during America's Civil War? And why doesn't that form of slavery still exist? On the other hand, the U.S. government protected inequality for enslaved blacks under the law from the beginning, implicitly, though directly, via the Constitution's protections for state institutions and for the slave trade for 20 years. And many of the original colonies continued to allow and protect slavery even as many new states expanded it. How could the Declaration have meant to condemn slavery if so many chose to protect it in the years that followed? Arguing over the meaning of the Declaration of Independence has continued from the Civil War to civil rights. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in 1863, 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, end quote. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech in 1963, I still have a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. One day this nation will rise up and live up to its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Both argued that the Declaration's principle was meant to apply to all men. Were they right? This webinar focuses on the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, which condemned slavery, and the debate over the final text of the Declaration to suggest that Lincoln and MLK and Obama were right about the Declaration's original meaning. It suggests furthermore that the original draft offers us insight into how the principles and practices of monarchy contributed to the development of slavery. It then seeks to raise fundamental questions about how the principled objection to slavery in the original draft was taken out, and what the consequence of that removal were for the meaning of the Declaration and for the practice of slavery in the new United States. In the debate over the draft, in the compromise that led to unanimous state support, was its meaning fundamentally changed? In the original draft, Jefferson accused the king of 18 acts of tyranny, the last and longest of which was supporting slavery. But it was almost wholly deleted, and it was the only one that was deleted. So, new slides. So here's some background information. Slavery was legal in every colony in 1776, and I'm sure most of you know this, or all of you know this, but I want to remind you. In New York, almost 20% of the population was enslaved in 1776. compared to 10% in Rhode Island, 3% in Massachusetts, 45% in Virginia, and 35% in Maryland. South Carolina was the only colony with a black majority. The Revolution led to all the states that we came to call the North getting rid of slavery, most of them slowly via gradual abolition plans begun by Pennsylvania in 1780, but some, like Massachusetts, by court decision. The Quock-Walker case of 1783 was the start. Yet, slavery expanded in the South after the 1790s, despite some gradual abolition plans and also some manumissions. Why the divergence? So, here's some takeaways that I'd like you to think about before I'm reading some of the notes as I'm talking, so just to see if there's anything I need to answer. First of all, deleted clauses are not just laughable clauses, that of course they were deleted, as most textbooks and scholars have assumed. They were barely removed, and we'll talk about how, and are important to understanding the document. And initially, all men are created equal did include slaves. The empire and British kings were far more important to encouraging slavery and creating a legal and military structure to support it than we have generally understood. By he, Jefferson and the others didn't just mean King George, but the monarchy and kings in general, following Paine's criticism of monarchy in Common Sense. And the price of unanimity was foregoing the explicit condemnation of slavery contained in the original draft. And it was South Carolina, and particularly Edward Rutledge, you guys have read something about, for whom this text was the sticking point. So, next slide. So we're going to begin with, this is the painting in the rotunda of the Capitol of the signing of the Declaration, which was painted much later by John Trumbull, who wasn't actually there. And so our first question is, how does this painting portray the debate? Does it look like there is much of a debate? Does it look like everyone just basically accepted the document?
Okay, well, let's do some visual analysis here. How does this painting portray the debate around the Declaration of Independence? And while we're waiting for some comments to come through, Holly, we have a question. How historically sound was Thomas Jefferson's argument that in bringing slavery to America and, let me see,
how historically sound? I would say it was much more historically sound than we used to think, and that's part of what I'm going to be exploring today.
Okay, wait. Let me make sure I got that question right. How historically sound was Thomas Jefferson's argument that, I guess, the Crown bringing slavery to America, and I don't think apparently Scott finished his question there. Okay, so let's go on to the painting. Actually looks confrontational, two sides against each other. Jennifer writes, it looks like a few were heavily involved and the others were simply listening and maybe adding things here and there. Leading statesman at the helm. The flags are from Trenton, which wasn't fought until December, a little ahistorical. According to the painting, there was no debate. Jefferson espoused cliques of signers that might indicate a debate, particularly those around the table to the far left. The only dissent, let's see, where did that one go?
So I'm going to click to the next one.
Well, hang on just a minute. The only dissent I see is one man standing up in a brown suit with his hand on his hip. Okay, right. So we don't seem to have a whole lot of debate going on. This seems to be... That
is Livingston, one of the original members, one of the original 5 members of the committee that drafted the Declaration, and he never signed the Declaration.
I know, which one?
The one in brown here.
One in brown. Okay, so it looks as if I think the consensus is that there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of debate going on, and I think that the way that line on the left, that kind of straight line of heads, shows that people are indeed all lined up in a row. This seems like the pinnacle moment. They're presenting the thing, and everybody's focused on it. Seem to be in accord, in agreement here.
Okay, so I'm just going to say to Char W, he just wrote this question about, was this about just the slavery of the colonists? And I'm going to argue it's about both, but see what you think and whether you agree with that. So,
okay. Holly, if I could interject, you don't need to worry about reading that chat. It'll just slow you down. Let me do that and bring it in, okay?
Okay, sounds perfect. I'll do that. Okay, so this is the only contemporary painting of the process of debating the Declaration of Independence, and it was done by Robert Edge Pine, who actually witnessed it, and it's now a painting owned by the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And how does this painting portray what's going on?
Okay, how does this one portray it, and how does it differ from the first? Second painting shows men in various groups talking and debating. There's more discussion portrayed here. In every group, leaders have courage to step forward. Not everyone will need to do that. Let's see. It looks like a Masonic hall. There's more side discussion. Doesn't seem much different to me. Just a few things. Franklin, your eyes are drawn to Benjamin Franklin, that figure, the white-haired figure in the front. He looks as if he's considering options rather than being decided. Much less orderly. Some look pensive. The two back-to-back suggest conflict. From previous readings, I was, okay, well, that's Andrea's comment is not about the painting. Okay, so this painting, I think the consensus here is that this one portrays a great deal more debate. You've got little groups of people talking amongst themselves. Some of them have their backs turned to the desk. Franklin does look pensive there. This doesn't look like it's, the unanimity that we saw indicated in the last painting.
Yeah. Could you respond to, I just want to say quickly to Pearlie Peters, this was the portrayal of who was in the room at that moment, and there were no people of color signing the Declaration or debating it. So it's a sad reality, but in fact, it's a reality, an important one we should recognize. Mm-hmm. Okay, so here is the original draft on the right of the Declaration of Independence. It came out of the Committee of Five who drafted it, and here is the final version. And I want to just say a couple quick things that, as you guys know from our introduction, at the introduction to the whole webinar that was advertised in June, only 7 states voted for independence, but they chose a Committee of 5 to draft it. And what the committee came up with was enough to make it so that in the end, all 13 states signed. However, when the draft was given to Congress on June 28th, Friday, when they reassembled on the Monday, July 1st, South Carolina, and particularly Edward Rutledge, who you read a little bit about, basically blocked it being accepted in that form. And before it was accepted, the text had to be changed. So there was a vote for independence the next day, but not until July 4th was the final text of the Declaration decided on. So I'm going to begin by asking you, what are the 4 main philosophical claims of the Declaration? What, according to, and here this relates to another reading, I don't know if you guys did it, but from William Ellery, he talks about watching as everybody signed their death warrant when they signed the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to ask it this way: what are the philosophical principles which these men seem willing to die for?
Okay, Amelia writes, all men have inherent rights. Be 1. See, Matt is typing, coming in here. While we're waiting here, people are commenting about how it's worthwhile to point out that documents are not drafted once. Good writing is rewriting. Mary notes the second, one of the other philosophical principles is that of a social compact. Another participant writes, all men are created equal. The only legitimate government is one based on the consent of the governed. Anything else? We got multiple people typing in. Let's see what comes across before we... Consent to the governed, inherent rights, created equal. Those are 3 crucial ones. There's one really, really important thing that you guys are missing. People have rights. Let's see. Let's wait. Natural rights. The colonies are entitled to withdraw from the tyranny of Britain. Susan Shapiro got it. These colonies are entitled to withdraw from the tyranny of Britain. So we'll go to the next slide. And here's the few lines. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are these unalienable rights. People establish government to protect these rights. Government derives power from the people. People have a right and a duty to change a government violates their rights. And I would actually add to this, after a long train of abuses. That is really emphasized, that it shouldn't be done for light or transient causes, right?
Right of rebellion. Right of rebellion is exactly right, Amelia. Okay. So, and I want to now point to something really, it's not, I guess, that fundamental, but one important change that helps us understand the deleted clauses later on, the section, and that is in the original draft, when they're talking about human rights, they call these sacred and undeniable truths that all men are created equal and independent, that from that equal creation they derive rights inherent and inalienable, among which are the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The final draft says we hold these truths to be self-evident. So very different language, sacred versus self-evident, and created equal, certain inalienable rights. So inalienable kind of changes. It's interesting. There are patterns, but what's mostly different is this language of sacred. And that's important because it comes up again in the deleted clause and helps us understand it.
There's another important difference here too, it seems to me. In the first one, the rights emerge from the fact of creation. In the second one, they are bestowed upon us. They are endowed by a creator. So you would comment on the significance of that change?
Right. I guess I'm most interested in the language, but it is much more abstract. So they're given these.
And we have a comment here. There was argument over unalienable versus inalienable. Was indeed there an argument over that?
There was. I mean, to me, that isn't as important as some of the other things, some of the other issues. Locke has come up a lot, I noticed in the chat, and I wanted to say that these are almost direct quotations from Locke. Locke does say property in some places, but actually if you look closely, I would argue with Locke, and I also spent a lot of time studying Locke and Locke's papers and Locke's work, that he does emphasize that more than one's possession of one's own self is one's most important property, and that ranks above other kinds of property, and I think that's important, and we'll get back to that later.
And Matt here asked the question, can you believe in natural rights and be an atheist? Why don't we defer that question till later on?
That's an important question, but not one, I mean, that's a really important question, but not one necessarily that we're going to focus on today, although it comes up in various ways as we see. So, what you're looking at now is page 3 of the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, and it's just part of it, and this is part of the deleted language that condemned slavery. And before we actually look closely at the text, I don't know how many of you can read this, but I want to point your attention, we'll look at the full clean text in just a minute, but notice here where Jefferson not only italicizes, but also capitalizes the word men when he's talking about men being bought and sold, determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold. He's talking about the warfare of the Christian king in Great Britain, which is perpetuating the slave trade, how he has waged, that is, the king has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty. So sacred, that's a repetition of the introductory language of the original draft. Okay, so now we'll look at the clean. And it's interesting how he's underlining infidel and Christian, that this is a Christian king who is, in fact, acting like an infidel. And here's a close-up of just that language so you can see it. So here's the full text, or not, it's actually not the full text. We'll talk about the second part of it in just a minute. But the first 2/3 of the deleted clause. And what I'd like to begin by asking is, what is Jefferson accusing the Crown of doing?
Okay, well, why don't we put this on the table? Why don't I read it just to get it out there so that we all are familiar with it, and then we can answer our discussion questions. He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian King of Great Britain. Determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative effort to restrain this execrable commerce. Before we get into the questions, could you, well, when Jefferson is talking here about prostituted his negative, he's talking about the king's essentially vetoing his negative. That would be the veto for suppressing every legislative effort.
So we'll talk about this just a little bit more later, but the royal governors in all colonies had standing instructions to prevent the colonies from limiting the slave trade and from trying to tax the import of slaves, certainly after the 1740s. And in some cases, when it did get through Virginia and went to the king himself in England, he taxes on the import of slaves to try to limit their importation. That George III himself actually vetoed it, but that legislation. So and by using the word prostitution, Jefferson is implying that he's doing it for gain.
Okay, so what is Jefferson accusing the crown of? And we have several answers. He is saying the king is supporting slavery and the continuing buying and selling of slaves throughout the slave trade. The king is determined to do these things. Who was opposing him, and when, before Thomas Jefferson, was this an issue? We're accusing the king of being a hypocrite here. I think he's accusing the king of not upholding Christian morals, like saying if he would violate Christian morals, he would violate any morality. He is accusing the king of being a Christian. Profit and gold is king, but also I believe Thomas Jefferson was a humanist, if almost an atheist. So he was not a religious hypocrite. The crown has violated natural rights of innocent people who never offended him. And then this participant, Kelly, mentions the referent of the word men, and she thinks it is referring to people in general. So Holly, did we get it right there? What is Jefferson accusing the crown of? Immorality, hypocrisy, prostitution? Fair enough to say?
Yeah, and I think men does mean people, but I think it particularly here means African people. And to completely understand that, I think you need to follow more of the debate. But of course, the captivating and carrying into slavery is pretty explicit. And Jefferson's also explicit in his discussion elsewhere of this particular clause that it meant Africans. And I think it's particularly important how the word men echoes also here. We'll use this at the only other place in the whole original draft where Jefferson used capitals and italics is when he wrote the United States of America. And what's interesting is Jefferson made 6 copies of the Declaration of Independence by hand to send to everybody, to people who knew, who wanted to see what had been written. And always he included the deleted clause. Always he underlined the whole of the passage. And always he wrote the word men in caps and italics when he referred to slaves.
So let me see if I can just sum up here and get this straight. You're suggesting that in that passage, when he used the word men, he is including African Americans among men, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So I know a lot of slaveholders believed that African Americans were subhuman at this time. And Jefferson is saying, no, they're not subhuman. They are men.
Right.
Okay.
And that in a way, I would say, in privileging this last item and making it the last, and I guess we could discuss whether the last is most important or not, but in making among the 18 acts of tyranny, which the original draft accused the king, it was the last and the longest, by far the longest, and clearly the most important, I would say, to Jefferson. He was horrified that it was taken out. So I think that's important, that it's the last. So
if I could just ask a question, how does this view square with what Jefferson said about the slaves in Notes on the State of Virginia? There he certainly doesn't sound as if he's arguing that African Americans are men in what he says about them there, about their intelligence, their stature, their smell, this sort of thing. How does that square?
That's a really good question. I don't want to get detoured on that, but I will just say this very quickly. The notes on the state of Virginia date from 6 years later, and
Mm-hmm.
and I think at that point he is somewhat maybe trying to rationalize, and there's some kind of offensive things he says there about potentially the intelligence of Africans, although he does say, I advance it therefore as a speculation only, but it could
Mm-hmm.
serve to rationalize slavery, some of what he says there. On the other hand, there's another section where of the notes on the state of Virginia where he essentially says that God would side with the Africans if they had a rebellion and should side with them because their fundamental rights are violated. He says, I tremble when I reflect that God is just, that his justice will not sleep forever. The given time, numbers, and inclination, a revolution in the wheel of fortune is among possible events. And then goes on to say, essentially, God would side with them if they had a revolution.
Right.
And in
Okay.
fact, when James Madison was governor of Virginia in in 1800 during Gabriel's Rebellion, and the rebellion wasn't successful, but they had arrested all these slaves along with Gabriel, and they were putting them on trial and executing them one by one. And when something like 35 were executed, Madison wrote to Jefferson and he said, what should I do? And Jefferson wrote back essentially that who can blame them for fighting for their own liberty? Mm-hmm. So Jefferson is really torn over these questions, and I don't want to talk about all his ideas in complex ways. I want to focus on this, but I'm happy to answer questions towards the end.
Okay. Shall we move ahead
then? So somebody writes, please speak to the idea among some scholars that TJ placed the slave trade passage within the original document knowing it would be deleted by the full Congress. I think that's just not true. The language with which, and I'll actually quote from one of his letters where he talks about it being deleted, but he was really horrified that it was deleted, and it would have been in there except for, in fact, the insistence by one state, by South Carolina, that they wouldn't agree to it until the language got changed. So I don't think it's he would know. Anyway, so here's the rest of the deleted clause, and that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye. He, that is the king, is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has also obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. And some of this language, this part, did end up in the final document, and we are more familiar with it because it is something that we where did Lord Dunmore's proclamation go?
Keep going. It's coming up.
Sorry, I got moved from where I had it. We're more familiar with it because he's referring here, and the declaration here is referring to Lord Dunmore's proclamation, which said that any servant or Negro who belong to rebels, if they come and join His Majesty's troops, will get their freedom. And so that particular passage in a slightly different form, or some part of that, did stay in the final document, and we're more aware of that section. So I'm going to now go back to this section. Why were the passage on slavery deleted from the Declaration? And so here's what Jefferson had to say about it, and there's various other clues which I found from all over the place, but these I think fit with what everybody else said. So what Jefferson wrote is, the passage reprobating the enslaving the inhabitants of Africa, and here he's very explicit, notice, was struck out in complaisance, that is, to please, to South Carolina and Georgia, who had never attempted to restrain the importation of slaves. And I'm just going to pause here, and I want to note very particularly that in the initial vote about whether to declare independence at the beginning of June, before the Committee of Five was even deliberating, Georgia was all in. They were ready to vote no matter what for the Declaration. So I don't believe that Georgia's resistance was important, but I do believe that most of the other colonies believed that South Carolina was not going to sign if that language was in there. And it's pretty clear reading correspondence from the period that Rutledge was the main objector. The other reason that Jefferson pointed to for the reason that people in New England ended up agreeing to have it taken out was that, quote, our northern brethren also felt a little tender under these censures, for though their people have very few slaves themselves, yet they had been pretty considerable carriers of them to others. And here, particularly, of course, the Rhode Islanders.
We have a question here about the slave market in Charleston. Was it one of the largest? And yes, indeed, it was one of the largest slave markets. We also have an interesting comment here from Char about the notes on the state of Virginia. Let me get that back up. I always wondered whether Jefferson was ideologically crowdsourcing a bit during the writing of the Declaration, being influenced by powerful anti-slavery luminaries, but then retreating to more pragmatic realities for him in notes back in Virginia. Do you think that's a possibility, that he was overly influenced by some of the anti-slavery luminaries in 1776?
I think somewhat, but I think actually, if you look at the whole course of Jefferson's writings about slavery, the only place where he has even a bare passage that could be seen as justifying slavery is that one text from the Notes on the State of Virginia. So I don't think it was just that. I think he really believed that slavery was wrong. Mm-hmm. But, you know, not that there weren't times when he tried to justify it, but he basically thought it was wrong. And you can find passages throughout to that effect throughout his writings, letters over the whole course of his career. Mm-hmm. Sounds strange, but I've read systematically through virtually all of Jefferson's correspondence before. So anyway, I actually, these, for some reason in the presentation, got put here and at the end, and we'll talk about more about Jefferson's own slaves and his debts and assets. But I'd like to move on for just a minute. Those slides will appear very soon, and talk actually very quickly and give some big background about the historical background behind of the history of the monarchical support for slavery. And here I show you just very quickly a painting of George III's coronation as king in 1760. He's the particular king about whom Jefferson is complaining. But really, if you look at the actual claims that are being made and the long history of the slave trade, and also the long history of monarchical support of slavery under the law, and actually, if you look at Jefferson's notes in other places, as in his legal notebooks, where he's very, very familiar with some of the court cases that I'm going to talk about just really quickly, it becomes clear that he knew this long history, and it isn't just him that knew it. They're really condemning monarchy in principle, and not just what George III is doing. So, questions: how did the British kings promote slavery? Most importantly, and we're going to talk about this in some detail in just a second, they protected and promoted the slave trade with their navy, forts off the African coast, which they actually fought wars to obtain, particularly the Second Dutch War between 1664 and 1666, supply of captives, in all of which the British government played a direct role. English kings prevented the colonies from taxing the slave trade or otherwise hindering it, and royal governors had standing orders to veto any such attempts. That's one. Second, head rights. By royal proclamation, those who imported slaves and bound laborers were given up to 50 acres of land. We usually talk about head rights as something that's liberating and democratizing. Here, this was a royal policy that deliberately encouraged large estates and bound labor. And I think that's really important to rethink and reconsider how head rights worked. And last but not least, the common and statute law of empire, people as property that could be mortgaged. And first, in a high court decision of 1677 that King Charles II was directly involved in, declared that all infidels could be considered simple property throughout the empire, which meant that all of a sudden people could be, if somebody took somebody else's property who was a person, that they could use all kinds of very powerful mechanisms to recover them, that property and people you could create a mortgage, for example, which you couldn't do before that. And there was some dispute about whether this was valid. And in 1732, a parliamentary law signed by, in this case, George II, declared that slaves were property in the empire. So I just want to put back in the ways in which across all colonies the empire was pushing and legalizing and legitimizing slavery. So that's, does anybody have any questions about what I've just said now?
Any questions?
Here,
So you're
I have
arguing.
a slide quickly.
Okay, Holly, just let me summarize here for a moment. You're arguing that, contrary to what historians have been saying for quite some time, the Crown actually did, to some extent, promote slavery in the colonies. So when Jefferson says that he sort of blames the king in the Declaration, there's some truth to that.
There's some truth to that. And of course, the people who bought slaves themselves were also responsible, but they were working within an empire that was promoting it on many different levels. The only way you could get land in early Virginia and Maryland was by buying a bound laborer. This is very clear imperial policy from the king on down.
So what about land grants from the Lord's proprietor? Did they come with
Similarly, the only way you got land in places like South Carolina, for example, were by buying bound laborers or importing yourself. But you could get some claim for yourself, but basically it was a system that was deliberately encouraging large estates and bound labor.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
So what I argue is this, so just to put this into context, Tom Paine's Common Sense, which was the first document that explicitly blamed the king and criticized monarchy in principle, was part of the overall thinking behind the Declaration. So those of you who know it and teach it, you can make that connection. So the next question is...
If I could just interject, we have a really good question here from Scott. He points out that these are old laws that didn't seem to be a problem until the Revolution. So Scott may be suggesting there that perhaps Jefferson's claim that the Crown forced slavery upon the colonies is a bit of a rationalization.
Well, there were 4 attempts in Virginia that actually passed the legislature to tax the import of slaves pretty heavily to try to limit their importation. Mm-hmm. And those all predated the Revolution. So I don't think this appeared suddenly with the Revolution. Mm-hmm. But of course it became much more explicit at that point. I think it was rather difficult to object about and to fight against. And I will only say a couple of quick words about this. It's something I could go on and on about. But criticizing the king's policies was actually a crime, and the crime was called sedition. And if you criticize the opinions of people, and especially the king, in print, there were pretty harsh punishments just for doing that. We don't punish sedition anymore, except in the military. But in fact, that's important for understanding, I think, the lack of what we see, obviously, in terms of discussions about slavery before the Revolution, when things just kind of broke open. Well, so my next, I will, a couple things that people raise. I can't help. I really want to answer them. Like Mary Oberdorfer says, what about things like the Slave Code of 1662? And that's the Virginia one that you're talking about that makes slavery hereditary. And first of all, Berkeley was a close confidant of Charles II. It's clear that Charles II played a role after the Restoration in 1660 in promoting slavery and slave codes in various colonies across the empire. And he had an explicit role in both Virginia's slave code, 1662, and also Barbados of 1661. And I won't go into detail about that, but and then were head rights systems inclusive of slaves? And I would say yes, explicitly so after 1660 in the royal proclamations that Charles II issued. So why did the British kings promote slavery? And here I'm going to point to 2 big issues. One, slavery was the flip side of monarchy. A prince is born the son of a king, just so a slave is born the son of a slave. The philosophy of birth status was the same for both. Slavery helped justify monarchy and vice versa. And I think you can see, if you go back to the initial principles of the Declaration, how that contradicts both monarchy in principle and slavery in principle, because it says you're not essentially born to a status. So that's ideological. But here and now relates to one of the other questions I saw earlier. But But slavery was a substantial source of revenue for the British Crown. So somebody said, why do they want to create large estates and bound labor? And it's because a crucial source of revenue for the British Crown, especially after 1660, when they got rid of feudal tenures as a part of the Restoration, was excise taxes on New World products. So, and especially sugar and tobacco. And both of these enumerated goods had to be sent to Britain. That's what the Navigation Acts were about. And were often accompanied by naval convoys to make sure they got there. And taxes were up to 12 times what was paid for tobacco in Virginia. Not 12%, 12 times. And these taxes were collected steadily from 1660 to 1776. They composed as much of 1/3 of the entire revenue of the British Kingdom, depending on the year. And I can say with confidence that in 1685-86, the taxes on sugar and tobacco were paying for more than it cost to keep the whole British Navy, or English Navy, and English Army at that point. There's, of course, Britain doesn't become Britain until 1707.
We have a question here from Mary. Were there duties on the importation of slaves themselves?
No, there were not. The monarchical policy was explicitly to encourage the importation of slaves. I mean, actually, there was a couple points early on when Virginia, for example, briefly placed a duty on slaves, but then it got repealed by the king. So there were a couple times when there were successful efforts by colonies to place duties on kings in the very beginning of the 18th century, but then they mostly got repealed.
Cheryl asked a really interesting question here. If the taxes on things like sugar and tobacco were so high, why do we teach that the tax on tea was trivial? And a follow-up question to that, if the taxes on sugar and tobacco were so high, why did the colonists focus on tea? Why weren't they?
Yeah, I think that's a super important question. And the answer is that these taxes on sugar and tobacco and a few other goods were collected from 1660 onwards, and they were collected in England itself. So in other words, the colonists had to export the goods, and the Navy tried to make sure they were imported to England. But these taxes were collected on the docks in England, and they were collected very rigorously, so much so that if you were a sailor and you stole a handful of tobacco that fell out of a barrel, you were subject to the death penalty. Mm-hmm. But for the colonists in the 1760s, when the new taxes were being imposed, like the stamp duties in particular, they felt like the king was then and Parliament was then deliberately trying to take control over what their colonial assemblies were supposed to be able to assess. So everybody knew these other collections were going on, particularly in Virginia and in places that produced these staple crops, but they had been going on so long and they were collected in England, they weren't easy to object to.
I see.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the sugar and tobacco tax those taxes are being paid by Britons, and the tea tax is being paid by colonists in America. So
right.
You get angry at a tax.
That's directly. I mean, in effect, the colonists are still paying those taxes because it's suppressing the prices, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I think that's crucial to it. And it isn't, somebody asked here, it's not just that the colonies were angry at the principle of taxation. They are angry at the idea of taxation without their consent that was local taxation, that then expanded more broadly, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. And we have just been here.
Internal taxes is the point that Franklin makes to Parliament in 1766 when he protests against the Stamp Act.
Right. We have here linking the slavery with the caste system. I don't think the monarchs would deign to justify themselves on the basis of affirming a slave system. They didn't even humanize slaves the way they did themselves, or furthermore deifying themselves. The caste system of power that existed was rationalization enough. So
I think that's about right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's fair. What you see here in this next slide is a proclamation issued by James, Duke of York and Albany, who was, of course, governor of New York and after whom New York was named. He later became James II between 1685 and 1689, and he was also Charles II's brother. He was in charge of the Navy. He was also from 1660 until 1689 in charge of the slave trade for England. And here is a proclamation in his name very openly in his name, which contains the seal of the Royal African Company, and which, if you read down below, and I won't bother you with the details, but in which he says, essentially, if you want a slave and you live in Virginia or wherever else, here's how much it will cost you. You need to prepay on the Royal Exchange. And the actual seal of the Royal African Company, I'll show you these down below, has not only Africans in it and an elephant and the castle, the forts that protected the slave trade on the African coast, but also the ducal crest, James' own personal ducal crest, and the seal of the Admiralty, because James, as Duke of York, was also Admiral of the Kingdom, as well as being governor of the Royal African Company and in charge of the slave trade for England. And the next slide, this is actually the seal of the Royal African Company as it was put onto documents. And I just want to read to you what the actual inscription reads: by royal patronage trade flourishes, by trade the realm. And Charles and James, sorry, the image got a little squished somehow in the translation. So these are actually the only gold coins minted during the reigns of James, Charles II, and James II. They are called golden guineas, named after Guinea and the profits of the slave trade, and Guinea in Africa, where the slave trade was based and their forts were based. And above, I just want to point out that underneath the actual image of Charles II here is the elephant and castle, which were the symbols of the Royal African Company. And here in James II, this too. So actually, the very coin of the realm connected monarchy and slavery.
We have a question here, Holly. Mary writes, was the Royal African Company given a monopoly on the slave trade?
They were given a monopoly, and in fact, Charles II owned the forts off the African coast personally. The castles, I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute. And he owned them not only because of war with the Dutch, but partly also as part of the dowry of Catherine de Braganza of Portugal, his wife. Mm-hmm. And he personally gave those forts to his brother James and to the company to conduct the slave trade in. And they had a monopoly power, which was actually quite rigidly enforced in the courts. And there were some people who got around it, but it was more powerful than I think the consensus often says. So here's a picture of the headquarters of the Royal African Company in 1682. And I just want you to see how big these forts are. These walls were many, many feet thick. They still stand today, and I'm going to show you a picture just a minute of the same fort still standing, the same castle. You can see the soldiers manning the fort, and these are, of course, English soldiers. You can see the little houses. You can see the seal of the Royal African Company, which we've looked at before. Yeah, and Elmira is another one, but we're not going to... Here's Cape Coast Castle today, and Cape Coast Castle in Ghana, still standing, all the walls. It would be very difficult to take down. So you can see exactly how big these forts are. And I'm just going to say this really quickly, and this probably will interest your students, that the main suppression of piracy, the mass execution of pirates, when you see 50 or 60 pirates being hanged at a time, was when they tried to interrupt the slave trade in the early 18th century.
So when Blackbeard blockaded Charleston Harbor, he was blockading slave ships from coming in the harbor, right?
Actually, Blackbeard's very complicated, and in that case in particular, he wanted medical supplies because he almost certainly had syphilis,
right?
And he wanted mercury. So not in that case, but a lot of the capture and trials of pirates were off the African coast, and we emphasize the war against the pirates in the Caribbean in the early 18th century, but in fact a lot of it was happening off the African coast as well.
And let me ask you this, the Royal African Company, where were they selling most of their slaves? North America, the Caribbean, where were they bringing most of them to?
Well, this picture shows very clearly, at least, it's a little bit difficult to see maybe in detail, but this is the Portuguese, where they were taking their slaves, and it was almost wholly to Africa. And the width of this arrow shows the extent to which different countries were involved in the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And England was taking most of the rest of the slaves, and that's these big arrows here.
So and most would be what, the third one up from the bottom?
Yeah.
And okay, so you've got the Portuguese, really hard to read. The British, yeah, that's the third one up from the bottom. And then you've got the French in the Caribbean.
This
Who is this skinny line up at the top? What?
um I can't even. Sorry.
Maybe we should
Um
have blown this one up larger.
yeah, it's a little bit hard to read. I
Hmm.
mean, some were directly there, but mostly, I mean, I think that's Americans after 18, because it's after 18, goes to 1807.
Okay.
But and this is a rough map, but I just wanted to emphasize that how thick this line of the English involvement, and before 1660 they're basically not involved in the slave trade, but also how much the forts or castles, somebody said castles was a better word, and that word was often used, were to actually making the slave trade happen. And even after the Royal African Company essentially opened up the trade to more English free traders, they only supplied English traders, and they did it for the benefit of the empire and the benefit of the king. So I think that's really crucial to acknowledge. And essentially, English taxes and the English Navy were protecting those forts.
And Mary has a question. Within the Caribbean, where were most slaves disembarking?
Barbados was one of the main English sites for the. It was the major colony, and Jamaica. And Jamaica was a major site of re-export as well. There's been some really good books recently on the
Yeah,
internal.
the sugar plantations were supposed to be really brutal, weren't they? I mean, there was a high death rate among the slaves there. So the Barbados needed a constant supply.
Yeah, there was, especially by the period when we have better data, which is the late 18th century and early 19th century.
Hmm.
There is some evidence that in the 17th century they weren't as brutal because the slaves were more valuable at that point.
Hmm.
But anyway, so I'm now going to move on to talking about through the question of Jefferson himself and the slaves which he owned, why this question of the empire's involvement in making slavery legal under the common law is so important. So this story is not just about Jefferson. He's an example here, and I think understanding what's going on with him is really important, but he's just one example. And so what I'm going to show you is this is actually an image from Jefferson's farm book. It's something he kept in his own handwriting. And in fact, you see this handwriting here, and it says January 14, 1774, the poll of the proper slaves is Thomas Jefferson. And these are the slaves which he inherited, some of them that he inherited from his father and mother, who is administrator of the estate, in 1767. And these are the ones at Monticello, and you can see their names. You can see actually the little marks indicate whether they're field workers or something else, and the ones without marks are children. And I'm just going to emphasize now as I go through that all of Jefferson's slaves were considered collateral against Jefferson's inherited debts to British merchants, and primarily from his father-in-law. And we're going to talk about why.
Hmm. We have a question here from Mary. She says she read somewhere, can't remember where, that Jefferson mentioned he made a natural profit of roughly 4% on an annual basis through the births among his slaves. Is that accurate?
I don't believe so. That's actually, I'm trying to remember the name of the scholar who wrote that, and it's a popular book that came out a couple years ago. I've looked at that. I think he actually fundamentally misinterpreted what Jefferson was writing in 1793. In fact, Jefferson never made much of a profit off his plantations or slavery or anything else. He was a pretty bad farmer. He barely broke even most years. So I that book, and I'm sorry again, I can't remember the name of the author. But it was at a later point, and I just don't think that Jefferson that particular passage was interpreted in the right way. If this person wants to contact me later, we could actually go through the evidence themselves, but
Okay.
ourselves. But don't think that's right.
Okay.
Anyway, so here's
Char,
this is.
if I could just interrupt once more, Char has a really good question here, and what I'd like to do is defer it until the end because this is really a summative question, so we can go through Jefferson and the slave finance. But she asks, if we accept the premise that Jefferson and others were truly against slavery, Does it necessarily follow that they truly believed all men, black and white, were equal? Is there a specific interpretation of equal that he intends? If so, let's hold that question till the end. That's really good, and we'll come back to that, Char. So now, Holly, why don't we focus on Jefferson and slave finance?
Right. Okay. So I want to just show you really quickly, and this is another page from Jefferson's farm book. Again, slaves he inherited, and it says, slaves conveyed to my mother, to me under the power given her in my father's will. And I just want to point out, Jefferson inherited almost all of the slaves he ever owned. His rare purchases were for husbands and wives of those he owned. However, almost all the slaves he inherited were mortgaged, and we're going to talk about what that means. Or, in fact, here's just a brief rundown of Jefferson's debts versus assets in 1776. And a huge problem for him was his father-in-law. So he got married to Martha Wales in 1772. And that same year, John Wales decided to invest in his own slave trading ship to Africa. And he borrowed 6,000 pounds from a British mercantile firm to send a ship that was not his, but he had renamed the Prince of Wales, W-A-Y-L-E-S, spelled this way, just like his name, and sent to Africa, where it picked up 499 slaves. We don't know exactly how many survived. This is an estimate, but it picked up 499 slaves in Africa. That we do know. It came back late in 1772, or early 1773, January of 1773, and by May, John Wales was dead. There were 3 heirs to the estate, and Jefferson and his wife, and then the 2 other daughters and their husbands. And Jefferson was executor. And this was all happening just as war was descending on Virginia. So Jefferson inherited from John Wales, and I actually can give a few more details even than are here, sort of 1/3 of a 17,000 pound debt. Including all that debt from that brand new voyage to Africa, and others from his father's estate at 6% interest, although not very much. And so you can say he had roughly 6,000 pounds of debt. His assets were land. He got 5,000 acres about from his father, and the 2 plantations from his father-in-law were worth about I've been figuring that out even since I wrote this up, and he probably inherited something like 11,000 acres from his father-in-law. So he probably, it's hard to tell if he could sell everything, but certainly in 1776, most of those plantations were completely unsaleable. We know from many other sources that Tories were fleeing Virginia. Nobody was buying, and when people could get money, estates were being confiscated. And when people could get money for estates, it was a fraction of the worth. And the other assets, in terms of slaves, he inherited 52 from his father and mother in 1767, and 135 from John Wales in January 1774. And that's quite aside from, or I can't quite tell whether it includes some of the slaves from the slave trading ship. And Wales did not take out an insurance policy. I do know that for sure because of all the court papers that ended up surrounding this whole issue, which Jefferson's English creditors would not accept paper currency, and the newly imported slaves he and the other inheritors tried to sell in 1774. They received only paper money, which was worth but a shadow of its nominal value, as Jefferson wrote. And in 1779, Jefferson deposited that money in the Treasury, according to Virginia law that he had helped to write, that said that debts to British merchants should be void as long as they were paid into the Virginia Treasury. In the end, because this law ended up being voided, in turn, the deposit made Jefferson deeper in debt for those slaves in the end. And Jefferson tried to sell Wales lands in 1774 to meet the debts, but could not because they were entailed initially. And after the Revolution, he sold some, but that he thought would be worth 4,000 pounds, but got little money. He stated the land was not worth oak leaves. That was his quote. Okay, so why am I going into such detail about this? And somebody says Jefferson considered slaves assets? Well, they were considered property under the law. He did not use that word. I am using it in terms of trying to show, in fact, their value is quite high, probably at least 10 or 15 pounds a piece, maybe more in this period. But I think the crucial thing is that under the law, they were considered Jefferson's primary asset, and land was actually not mortgageable under this period, but slaves were. And I just think I want to pause and really make a point of that, because under the law, the fact that people as property were considered mortgages was really important, so that it means, if you think about it in terms of how we under the law own a car, and if you owe money to the bank for the car, you don't really own it, the bank owns it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you can't sell the car, you can't give it away if the bank really owns it. And so what I want to point out is that the Virginia Manumission Law of 1782, which said for the first time that masters could free their slaves, so for most of the 18th century you could not free your slave legally. It said you could only free them if you were free of debt, because your slaves were considered your primary asset. And if you had any debt, they were considered mortgaged against the value of what you owed. And court decisions in Virginia after the Revolution upheld this provision. Creditors could seize free slaves and sell them. So if you tried to sell a slave and you owned, if you tried to free a slave and you owed debt, your creditor could seize the slave and resell them. This is really important to understand how the law worked. And somebody's saying, could you transfer an indentured contract? And the answer is yes. If it was made in England, it was always transferable. And Pearlie Peters says, am I kind of defending him? I don't think defense is the right answer. I think I am trying to understand the context in which he was acting, and I think it's really crucial that we do that. And I want to just say really quickly, I'll talk a little bit more about Jefferson, but the terms of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War in 1783 allowed enforcement of all debts owed to British merchants, most of which were mortgages on slaves. So this isn't just about Jefferson. This is about, more broadly, everybody who owed debts to British merchants had to pay them back at a particular percent interest, and most of those mortgages were against slaves. So in some fundamental level, the terms of the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolution kept in place the common law of empire that turned people into property. Now, does that mean Jefferson couldn't have sold all his land and thereby freed his slaves? I think you can do the math and probably make it just work at some point, but it would have been really, really difficult.
Well, we have a question here from Char, if I could interject. Is the reason that land was not mortgageable but slaves were, was that there was so much land in America that it was so cheap and not good collateral?
Actually, I think it had more to do with what was going on in Virginia at this point, where a lot of land was entailed, which means that it was set up into fixed hereditary patterns from eldest son to eldest son, so that it was often not transferable. And in fact, a lot of the land that Jefferson had was entailed before the Revolution, and so that it had not been a good asset to use against debts. If that makes any sense?
Okay. And we have Judy Batten asking a question that we discussed earlier. How widespread was slave ownership at the time of the Revolution? We just want to review that, Holly. I'll just review it really quickly. Slaves were owned in every single state at the time of the Revolution, with the possible exception of Vermont, which wasn't an official state anyway, but in Massachusetts, it was one of the least. It was about 3% of the population were enslaved. In New York, it was about 20%. Rhode Island, about 10%. Virginia, about 45%. Maryland, about 35%. And in South Carolina, it was about, just a little over 50%. Depends on exactly what year you look at. Okay. Well, shall we move ahead? And I agree here with Susan Shapiro's comment.
about he did not immerse himself in the buying and selling of slaves. He was deeply in debt, and the law of the realm said that slaves were property. And I think that's really important. But I also do want to point out that about after the Revolution, about 10% of Virginia slaves were freed in the decade after the Revolution ended. It's really striking. If you look at the census records from this period and you look at other records, you can vividly see this pattern of masters freeing their slaves. And some people like Robert Carter III, who was a friend of Jefferson's and who owned more than 500 slaves, freed all of his slaves by indenture in 1791, or tried to. He couldn't do the children, and that ended up being a problem later on. But and so some people have said, well, Jefferson should have been like Robert Carter. Well, Robert Carter had no debt. He had a ton of assets. And Jefferson was really stuck, particularly because of the actions of his father-in-law, John Wales, in 1772, especially with that last slave trading voyage. He got really messed up in terms of the way the law worked. And it was something he was very resentful about. And as I said, does this excuse him? No. But it does help explain some of the contradiction that we see.
So then Washington, too, must have been a pretty successful farmer and entrepreneur because he freed slaves when he died, right?
Washington was much more successful, but actually I would say it's not just his success. He married, it was reported at the time when he married Martha Washington, what was her name? Remember her maiden name. Anyway, she was the quote-unquote the richest relict, which means widow, richest relict in Virginia, and she was immensely wealthy. And in fact, she owned more slaves and property than Washington did, and she didn't fully convey it to him at the time of their marriage.
Oh, so he married well, huh?
Washington married extremely well. Yes, he didn't, and he didn't have a lot of debt. But most plantation owners in Virginia in 1776 were more in the situation of Jefferson than that of Washington or Robert Carter III, who were two of the richest men in Virginia and had very little debt.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here from Peggy Moore. Do we know anything about Jefferson's personal treatment of slaves?
Yes, we know quite a lot. There's been some fabulous work on it, and he seemed to be he rarely whipped his slaves. He rarely sold them away. There's one or two cases where he, in the case of especially violence of one enslaved person against another, he did sell a couple of people away. He provided his slaves with toothbrushes. Mm-hmm. Small detail, but I thought that was interesting. On the other hand, he did. It's hard. I think slavery is a terrible system, and it's clear that he didn't escape, everything. But I guess one of the details that I think has come out that's pretty interesting when you track the descendants of some of his slaves, they ended up being leaders later on in civil rights movements, even starting in the late 19th century. So I think that's interesting.
Scott makes a really important point here. He points out that slavery of the 18th century was different from the newer slave system after the cotton gin and expansion into the Old Southwest. Washington expressed difficulty caring for his slaves as he switched agriculture from tobacco to wheat. Again, the system wasn't working well until the gin and the new market for cotton and the land for it. I think that is a very important point to make. Seems that slavery, would it be fair to say that slavery was, we say, dying out? Is that too strong before the advent of the cotton gin?
I think that's way too strong. I think that the point that Scott makes is one that's emphasized in textbooks, but it's also one of economic determinism that tends to underplay the importance of these philosophical arguments. And I think the cotton gin made some difference, but I don't think cotton determined the course of slavery any more than sugar or tobacco completely did. I think, in fact, larger policies that encouraged the development of staple crops and that allowed, vast money making on the basis that people were property and continued that are what really allowed the expansion. The fact that you could make money off of these crops is important, but slaves were used in so many different enterprises. You look at North Carolina, where they were used to produce wood products. rice in South Carolina. I don't think it's just one crop or another. I think it's a principle of large estates and bound labor and the perpetuation of that, which is crucial.
And
now,
in the 19th century, in
just
Richmond,
really quickly, I see so much discussion on this list of Jefferson and Sally Hemings and whether he followed slave children. And I will just say, if you're interested in this, read Annette Gordon Reed, either one of her brilliant books. And of course, the DNA evidence shows that Jefferson had a long-term relationship with Sally Hemings and 4 children with her. That relationship was very interesting and very difficult. Yeah. And Jefferson did try to teach. Anyway, so I'm getting distracted by the chat room, which I shouldn't probably, so I won't. But anyway, go ahead, Richard.
Well, I was just going to say, shall we wrap up? We've got. Did you explain to folks what that other slide was? The previous slide about that resource, that one there.
Oh, this one is a website put together by the Library of Virginia, which showed some of those who were manumitted in Virginia after the Revolution. So, so I want to just make sure I've covered a few crucial issues, and I also wanted to talk a little bit more about your American class programs. There's one part of the website that also talks about a lot of the petitions that slaves wrote to state legislatures in the Revolutionary period, arguing that they deserve the freedom on the same grounds for which the Revolution was fought. So I think those need to be included in this discussion as well.
Okay. And we have Char makes a comment here. One of the things I struggle with is that we lionize Jefferson for the ideals he conveys in his words about equality. So it's difficult to dismiss his words and notes on slaves without having some pause about his comments on slaves. That is a troubling aspect to Jefferson. And if we could go back to Char, the question Char raised earlier, if one is opposed to slavery, does that necessarily mean you believe that all men are created equal? Could it not be that in that passage that was deleted, what offended Jefferson was the slave trade, and that because simply it turned people into property, and that he really wasn't, he didn't really consider it a breach of equality. It was just mistreating human beings and treating them in ways that did not comport with Christian morality.
I believe
Holly still there? Hope we haven't lost Holly. Let me mute her microphone here and turn it back on. Yeah, Holly, you still there? Oh no, we had some audio problems last time, and apparently they have come back just when Holly was telling us what she believed. Let's see. Send her a message. Technology is a wonderful thing until it isn't. All right, let me see if Holly can hear us. Well, she's not on the board anymore. Okay, let's see. Holly needs just to check back in with us. Let's see if she has done that. Yep, there she is. Let me get her back. Okay. All right, Holly. You are a presenter once again, and you need to probably turn on your mic. I apologize for this, ladies and gentlemen. As I said, technology is a wonderful thing until it stops working, and it apparently is for the moment.
Hello, or am I here again?
There, you're still there. We got you back. Okay. I don't know what I don't know what happened, but I'm glad you're back. So my question was, could Jefferson have been in that passage that was deleted from the Declaration? could he have been offended by the violation of Christian morality without believing that the slaves were equal?
Okay, I think the question of equality is very difficult. And I think certainly in terms of equality in front of the law and the whole question of separate legal treatment for Africans and being born, or people who are enslaved and being born to a status, I believe that Jefferson really did think that was wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, did he believe that they deserved complete equality of opportunity, I suppose you could say, or to be able to have political power or whatever? I don't think he ever spoke to that. I mean, he was mostly just concerned with the simple question of freedom under the law and not being born to a status. And that was where he stopped. I mean, it leaves a lot open to question. One of the most fascinating things to me about Jefferson is he was on the committee on this question, and it's not emphasized at all, is he was on the committee to reform the Code of Laws for Virginia during the Revolutionary period, a reform that didn't really happen until 1796. And as part of that, in fact, slightly separately on a separate letter, he wanted to, in fact, get rid of the heavy use of the death penalty and bodily punishment in Virginia. But when he was asked about whether that should happen for people who were slaves, he wrote back he wanted to replace it with imprisonment, especially, but also in some cases he wanted some bodily punishment, but anyway. But when asked whether his plan could apply to those who were enslaved, he said, the enslaved are already imprisoned, so prison holds no punishment for them. It's a rather telling remark.
Yeah. Well, he's one of our most fascinating and complex figures in our history. I know you wanted to raise the framing questions again and go back over them and ask our participants if we've addressed them all. Do you have any? Let's put the question to our participants. Do you have any comments now on the framing questions? Anything we left unanswered? Sure, go ahead, Harry. Sure.
Quickly, we've talked more about Jefferson himself, but I don't see this as just about Jefferson at all. Mm-hmm. I think what was going on in that original draft did represent some of the main ideas of the Revolution that were held by a majority of the participants of the Continental Congress at that period. That there was a close connection between slavery and monarchy, that a lot of people, and I guess it's really interesting to me that a lot of people, slavery wasn't just a metaphor, it was really something that was wrong. And when you start to understand that question at the same time as you do the ways in which slavery was legally so imbricated, and because it was legally so imbricated, people could still make a big profit. I think it helps to make sense of why slavery was gotten rid of in some places, but also accelerated in others. So that Jefferson is kind of at this nexus, and we've talked a lot about him, but he's just part of the story.
Okay, and Kelly writes, if you could illuminate the question about how the debate helps us understand the North-South split of the 1790s.
So I want to go back to something I mentioned very briefly at the beginning. In 1797, St. George Tucker, who was one of Jefferson's mentors and a lawyer in Virginia, brought before the Virginia legislature a proposal for the gradual abolition of slavery in Virginia. And it only got about a third of the support of the votes. It only got a third of the legislature. It didn't get the majority that it needed to pass. And I think this is really important to pay attention to, as well as the fact that 10% of Virginia's slaves were freed after the Revolution. There was this momentum to try to shift things that had a lot of force behind it at that moment. And in fact, ironically, even if you look at indenture contracts for free black children in the 1780s, they're the same as the indenture contracts for whites, and they're supposed to be taught to read and write, etc. There was this moment of hope, and more than a moment. But with slavery being so legally imbricated, and this people as property still continuing in those places, and there just wasn't enough support to make it completely happen, and too many people had too deep vested interests, so it was really hard to get over that hump. Whereas places like New York, which we talked about, where 20% of the population was enslaved, was the last to actually set up a gradual abolition plan, and they only did so in 1804. So you have this, and they barely got over that hump. So you can see how this mess of essentially a common law that existed from the earlier period helped to restrain this push towards getting rid of slavery. And I mean, and it was really profitable for a lot of people. And the other thing is, I mean, this is it's really horrible, but a lot of slaves were confiscated from loyalists by some of the patriot generals as well, and who then made it so that they were able to keep them. So there was a lot of profiteering by some of the patriots in places like South Carolina, especially the Deep South, and they created a different kind of momentum. I don't know. Obviously, this is a huge question. I can't completely answer it here, but
now Mary writes here that one of the reasons for that North-South division was that question of infrastructure in the South. There was not a great deal of infrastructure in the South at the time. This probably comes into play more in the 19th century, wouldn't you say? When the two economies are beginning. I know they were divergent in the 1790s, but as the 19th century progresses, the two economies become much more divergent as the South becomes plantation, even more agricultural economy, and the North becomes more of an industrial and a diversified economy. Of course, it's still quite agricultural.
I think that's absolutely true, that they took different developmental paths. On the other hand, I would say those developmental paths were to some extent also shaped by these pre-existing land ownership patterns with these really large estates, etc. So there wasn't, it's hard to develop infrastructure in places where somebody owns, I don't know, 10,000 acres, whatever. Robert Carter III, who I mentioned, had more than 100,000 acres. Or no, not almost 100,000 acres. I mean, this is just unbelievable amounts of property.
In Virginia.
So
Mary writes here, wouldn't we consider 1793 a turning point?
And I guess that's because of the cotton gin. Again, we emphasize that, but I don't think it's just the cotton gin. I would actually point to 1800 and Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia, which also extended into North Carolina. And up to that point in Virginia, there was a lot of liberalization of the slave codes. And not that they could ever be humane, but they made them somewhat less inhumane, I think you should say. And more flexibility in terms of free blacks and hiring out, etc. Some punishment of masters for punishing their slaves who hurt them, injured them, things like that. But after Gabriel's Rebellion, you saw a real tightening of the slave code, repeal of some of the more liberalizing, slightly liberalizing elements. And there's this great quote from one of the members of the Virginia legislature, a man named Pettigrew, who wrote, "It's a pity, but slavery and tyranny must go together." Sort of giving, I mean, and you can see other turning points after Nat Turner's Rebellion when, masters became prohibited from teaching their slaves to read, etc. But I would say it isn't. I think I would de-emphasize cotton, which by emphasizing the crops, you de-emphasize the human agency. And I think the human agency needs to be a crucial part of this.
And if you could just briefly remind us of Gabriel's Rebellion, what went on?
Oh, Gabriel was a free black man who planned this very big rebellion, and he, among other things, had the guy who was in the slave who was one of the people guarding the what's it called, the magazine where many of the weapons in Richmond were kept, and ammunition involved, and he had a lot, apparently quite, hundreds of people involved in this conspiracy, and the idea was to kill everybody who opposed letting them be free, I suppose. And he was really influenced by the Haitian Revolution and by George Washington. He
Yeah.
compared himself to George Washington. And
Yeah.
but the huge hurricane happened the night that the rebellion was supposed to happen, and then people chickened out and informed two masters, and the whole thing got discovered. So nothing actually happened. Nobody was actually killed, but a lot of those who were involved in the planning, including Gabriel himself, were executed. That was
Right.
in 1800.
And
there was
one
another part of it in North Carolina in 1802.
Right. How about, would you consider it more important than the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina?
Um, um, all these rebellions are important in their own ways. They tend to have similar impacts in the tightening of the slave codes. In some ways, though, I would consider Gabriel's rebellion more important because the trajectory of the slave codes was always in that direction to become more stringent in the colonies in the early 18th century. But before Gabriel's rebellion, there was actually really a movement in a more, I mean, it's possible Virginia could have gone more in the direction of gradual emancipation, but Gabriel's rebellion turned everything around in the attitude of the legislature. There's no question.
Yeah.
So,
and through Gabriel's rebellion, the Haitian rebellion struck fear in the hearts of the slave owners in North America. Well, ladies and gentlemen, yes, go ahead.
Well, especially because it led in part to mass executions of whites. So, so I would really like your feedback on what you found most interesting. So I hope you're able to give me some feedback. This is part of a book that I'm working on, which goes into detail about the involvement of the British Empire and British monarchy in the development of slavery. It isn't, of course, just them, but the fact of the empire, the power of the empire plays a big role in how slavery develops in the colonies. And so the book begins with some of what you see here, but I would really love your feedback.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, you will be able to give Holly your feedback on your evaluation, so please don't forget those. And if you would like to elaborate, we ask a series of questions, but if you want to elaborate and talk more about what you found most interesting and most challenging in the topics, please do that as well. Please remember to check our America in Class social media outlets. We are on Facebook and Pinterest. I want to thank Holly for giving us an excellent webinar tonight. A lot of this material I know was certainly new to me, and I suspect it was new to our participants. Thank you very much, Holly.
Thank you all for attending, and feel free to email me if you have more questions.
Okay, you can email us and we'll pass the things on to Holly if you'd like. And I want to thank our participants for their intelligent and engaged participation this evening. Please stay tuned for our next webinar. We're going to switch to looking at American literature. We're going to be talking about Kate Chopin's novel, The Awakening. So please tell your American literature colleagues to tune in for that one. That'll be Thursday, November 5th at 7 p.m. Again, please send those evaluations to us. Thank you for your participation this evening, and good night.
Good night.